3 lessons on power and sovereignty. The core principles anyone needs to understand. I have been live streaming a lot on power recently and started thinking about the most fundamental lessons I'm trying to convey in my videos about power and sovereignty. There are many ways to approach the topic of power, one of which is looking at a historical analysis of political sovereignty. Naturally, the most prominent author in this sphere is Carl Schmitt, a controversial figure, though still relevant to the study of political dynamics. The principles I will be exploring in this article are derived from Schmitt's own work on sovereignty. However, I will be elaborating on his concepts by drawing on Bertrand de Jouvenel as well. Examples of current events and cultural dynamics shall exemplify the relevance of both Schmitt and de Jouvenel in our age. Power is elite business. Before getting into the intricacies of Schmitt's arguments, I shall clarify the context within which most historical analyses of power take place. Power is exerted by a minority over a majority, in other words, an oligarchy. This is referred to as the iron law of oligarchy without being a scientific law or theory with specific predictive qualities. This iron law arises due to the natural way to record history through the lens of a small number of relevant people impacting the lives of millions. Every story of the past must limit itself to those characters, even if the choice of relevant historical actors varies somewhat across historians. This applies regardless of the particular governmental structure. If we were to inspect the history of a monarchy, we would be focusing our analysis on the royal family as the ruling elite. Similarly, if we were to look at a democracy, we would be focusing on an elite minority of elected officials and bureaucrats. Obviously, there is a spectrum between the elite and the rest, and an elite is never static or permanent. However, most of power politics plays out inside of elite circles, where the elites within the elite strives to hinder any aspiring rulers from rising up in the hierarchy. The pyramid always serves as an excellent analogy. The top of the pyramid is itself a smaller pyramid with its own top, and so on. The most important distinction in politics is that of friend and enemy. Power is a process. If it is not exerted, it disappears. In other words, power needs to be used for its own sake in order to sustain its existence. Throughout history, we can observe a general tendency for power to keep growing, never giving itself up, until it is brought down through external force or internal instability. In order to mobilize enormous masses of people to participate in the expansion of power, powerful myths are employed that serve one important political function, namely to identify the enemy. If the masses are convinced of the existence of some particular villain or danger, the powerful are justified in exerting power to suppress that evil. The reason this dynamic can be seen across history is simply because it can be very useful. Such mass coordination of people is effective at neutralizing actual threats. However, the larger and more complex a society becomes, the more opaque and amorphous the genuine threats to that society become, opening the door to all kinds of imagined enemies. The strategy to invent new enemies or embellish the image of otherwise minor threats is a proven method for elites to consolidate their rule. The myth or story about our political enemy, called a political formula, is told to maintain a regime in its current form. This formula is the magic spell that keeps us all in submission to powers we do not understand. The magic can wear off over time as soon as the political formula becomes impossible to believe. Especially if the political enemy is truly being destroyed, it will increasingly become obvious that the exertion of power against that enemy is no longer needed. An excellent example can be found in the current rise of anti-woke sentiments that arose from a skepticism of so-called woke principles. Although barely anyone refers to themselves as woke, the vague set of ideas that people associate with the term does identify a political enemy, namely that of the white supremacist, patriarchal, sexist, imperialist, capitalist, racist, hetero, cis male. Hence, the political formula of wokeism describes a clear elite demographic that they are willing to remove from power. The only problem is that this demographic has been on the decline for longer than the term woke has been around. Wokeism represents merely this last, implausible stage of Western progressivism that has been exerting power over the originally very real threat of white supremacist imperialism. The once strong and dominant powers are now in decline, and our political formula has entered the stage of wokeism. The lesson we take from this is that the political enemy tends to be a former ruling elite now taken down by a new elite. This dialectic of old and new elite is the motor that drives the eternal cycle of power and overthrow. The state is the material incarnation of a divine principle. Schmidt's most famous work is titled Political Theology, in which he argues that most of our state institutions can be traced back to religious institutions. It so happens that most political formulas, until recent history, have been of some religious nature. The simplest way to understand this is that religious ideas and stories can outlive people. Throughout history, many empires would not last beyond the life of a single ruler, such as Alexander the Great, Attila the Hun, or Genghis Khan. To avoid immediate collapse and instead maintain a political rule for generations, there needed to be a unifying myth that sustained the idea of the king throughout multiple rulers. The church provided the necessary formula for this, which allowed the exertion of power to take root in the hearts and minds of the people. This is where the idea of sovereignty takes its original form. Initially, sovereignty, the right to rule, was bestowed upon a king by God and God alone. The right of succession, with all its rituals and professions of loyalty, were sustained by a clerical elite for the duration of multiple kings and dynasties. Later, however, the kings of the early Enlightenment allied with the masses to overthrow these clerics, ushering in the age of popular sovereignty. However, as power never gives itself up, the institutions and worldly mechanisms of enforcing power did not get abolished but were repurposed by new regimes. Moreover, the emancipation from religious restrictions allowed for much more rapid expansion of power into the kind of monstrous bureaucracies we have today. Today, nobody could convincingly argue that these new administrative systems still derive their legitimation from popular sovereignty. Instead, de Jouvenel argues we are faced with a new sovereignty of law. Law had originally been a divine principle given to the likes of Moses by God or to Hammurabi by the gods. Law was to govern humans and the heavens alike. Today, the law has become a political mechanism of control. Yet, it arguably still derives its power from a religious belief in the Constitution and democratic principles as outlined in the Declaration of Human Rights. The sovereignty of law we are dealing with in current times arose in opposition to an excess of political, popular sovereignty known as populism. The elite of our times represents a technocratic bureaucracy that manages populations according to scientifically backed laws set by the sovereign, though the sovereign himself, however, is not subject to law, he supersedes it. The sovereign resides over the state of exception. The ultimate form of societal power is the ability to rewrite rules and redefine the structure of society. For example, Constantine the Great had the religion of the entire Roman Empire changed to Christianity. In terms of law, it means that the sovereign can decide over the state of exception where laws can be overridden and rules are disregarded. The most basic form of an exception is the declaration of war and martial law. Because of its relevance and frequency, war is commonly featured in historical research as the most important type of happening. War represents the time at which the exception becomes the rule and the balance of powers is redefined. At the same time, war represents something chaotic that evades control from any powerful party, as it may devour the very entity that initiated it. Naturally, a multitude of factors may trigger a state of exception. The pure economic feasibility of a state of war represents a contributing factor, as well as the general agreement on whether the political enemy has become an immediate threat. In modern times, a state of exception can be entered during novel forms of warfare, such as bio and information warfare. A perfect example is the COVID-19 pandemic that ended up redefining the rules of public life for the best part of 3 years. Though brief, those few years exacerbated the problems with complex modern society in which it becomes increasingly difficult to identify a sovereign actor during processes such as lockdowns. The principles of sovereign power, whether secular or religious, cut across all political ideologies. Sovereign power neither lies exclusively within the capitalist market economy, nor can it be found in some purely institutional state machine. It is rather distributed across vast societal networks so complex that in our current world we may only understand parts of it. Today's power is exerted globally and can be found in a variety of arrangements such as the academic system or the military-industrial complex. None of these structures are purely political, scientific, or economic, but lie at the intersection of all of these intimately interwoven systems of control. Our globe today is enmeshed in a tight-knit web of power relations in which sovereignty is nowhere and everywhere at the same time. Our global war machine works on all fronts, generating profits, engaging in information control, and most importantly, expanding the sphere of power. As soon as we remove ideological filters and see that political formulas do not care about consistency with any particular schools of thought, we begin to see how power truly behaves.